We've got Lee Garrett, we've got Tomasita Medal, and Jim Willems, all from the original experimental college, as well as being a part of so many other different things going on during the time, which we'll hear about then at that. I want to go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Dan Curtis Cummins, current faculty director of the new EXCO, I will say. Very different EXCO than what was started by Dr. Garrett here, which we'll hear about. Very different but similar. Maybe we'll hear about some of the similar societal contexts that are going on, possibly some of the ways the administration is centralizing power in the university currently. So we can hear about some of those things. I also just want to say that with such a big turnout, we've also got a lot of people on Zoom. This is amazing. Thank you all. We are going to have questions and answers at the end. So please save all of those questions for the end for either Dr. Garrett or either the two Zoom participants that will be on Zoom here. Okay. I want to say we'll hear about those differences that were started in the 60s that really were revived in 2017 by Kathy Emery. Kathy Emery was the person who brought the experimental college back to SF State. So I see a lot of my EXCO teachers out here. That was because of her. So I would say it was originally because of people like Dr. Garrett that she brought it back. So thank you all for being here. Without further ado, I do want to introduce Dr. Garrett. I'm going to go ahead and not share the screen right away, but when we have some pictures and videos to share, let me know. I will share the screen for you. I also have some of the original experimental college course catalogs. Give you all a chance to kind of feel these as we pass them around. Take a look at some of the classes that were happening back then. This is a full one. Oh, sorry. These are some of the shorter ones there. Okay. So we have some real life artifacts. Thank you, Bella, for helping me out there. All right, and please, Dr. Garrett.
You ready?
I'm ready.
Oh, okay. All right. Good afternoon. My name was Jimmy Garrett, was always James Jimmy Garrett. And we weren't expecting this kind of group this size. Usually when an organizer starts working, it's 4 or 5 people. And then we expected a huge group of 15. So I want to thank you very much. And I mean, maybe y'all too. I mean, I'll applaud you because I worked in houses where 3 or 4 people were considered to be a barn burner. Well, that would have been fantastic. Just very, very good to see so many people here, even if you were pressed into doing it by your instructor. So maybe something positive will come out of this that's worthwhile. First, I want to thank Professor Grace Yu, who I've been working with for some time on this, and Professor, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't mean to get in your way. Oh, there we go. You're good now. All right.
Am I good?
I think so.
That's a very odd thing to say. Most people don't say that. It's very, very bad. And Professor Daniel Curtis Cummins, who I just met. So I want to thank them for the invitation. And Tomasita's out there somewhere. I want to thank her for participating. I don't know Mr. Willems, but...
Sorry, I've had my hand raised. I was trying to let you folks know that Tomasita is still trying to get in, and she says the host will let you in soon, so nobody's let her in yet.
Okay. They'll be right away.
What was that? Did I miss something?
No, you're good.
Okay. First, I've been asked to say this. It sounds like there's an echo, but I've been asked to say this. That there was the title of the presentation includes the Third World Liberation Front. And there's been a whole history of struggle around that question about the Third World Liberation Front. So for 40 years, 30 to 40 years, the strike itself was called the Third World Liberation Front student strike. And that's false history. That is not to say that there wasn't tremendous involvement by huge numbers of people, non-white, what we call in the old days Third World. But there was no Third World Liberation Front during the entire life of the Experimental College. In fact, Third World Liberation Front was formed as a support group by the Black Student Union to pull together constituencies that we had worked with for the prior 3 years as a support base for the strike. So that's just to clear up the history that there was no Third World Liberation Front. Because I caught a lot of hell from people who were from the Third World Liberation Front and from Black Student Union who said, we have to keep history clear. The second thing is that when before my wife Ann and I were on out, we just came back from Vietnam. We just spent a month there before we left. That's when we agreed to do this project. They sent out a notice about an article or an essay written about the experimental college that was formed here on this campus, and really the history of experimental college that began in Wisconsin, and had kind of scattered in a scattered way all over the country. That there's a piece called This Quiet Revolution. This Quiet Revolution. And I agree that it should be read. It's a very, very good summary of some of the struggles that went on. It sums up the history of some of the relationships between the Black Student Union and the experimental college. It's wrong in its summary and analysis, which we'll come back to, but it's very, very good in at least introducing people to it. What was the experimental college? In 1960, in May, there were a series of demonstrations in opposition to a set of hearings that were put on by the House of Representatives in San Francisco. It was called the House Un-American Activities Committee. This was a traveling committee that went all over the country exposing people who were liberal, who had liberal consciousness and ideas, and trying to convince the country that these people were un-American. This was a part of a long, about probably a generation after World War II, of trying to consolidate a conformity among the American people in opposition to what was called communism in those days. Today it's called woke, but in those days it was called communism. And the idea was to set a certain kind of pattern or standard that everyone had to take a loyalty oath to this country as it stood. As it stood, Mexican workers were called wetbacks. That was as it stood. About 40% of the country was under apartheid. Apartheid in South Africa had learned its lessons and had studied segregation in the South and had appended that over to taken that to South Africa and applied it. That's how intense or entrenched segregation was in the United States. During the World War II, women were really the major productive force in this country. And after World War II, there was a program to send women home so that men could replace them or go back to where they were. Because during those times, the great replacement theory was about women. The fact is that women produced the airplanes, the tanks, the guns, etc., that carried on World War II. And we didn't want that to be too deeply instilled in women that they might come up thinking that they might be independent human beings. So they were basically sent home. So these are some of the issues that were raised during this House Un-American Activities Committee. And what happened was that working class students, young people, mainly whites and Asians, came out and joined unions, various union organizers and members of the ILWU, and they fought against, they attacked the city hall of, and that's something, attacking the city hall of, in San Francisco, and fought them for about, all in all, for about 5 days. At the end of that struggle, what had happened was a kind of cultural unity had developed among young people. And this was, again, in 1960, so it's at the end of what I call an immature cycle of the development of fascism in this country. It was immature because it didn't have all of the coalescing forces to make a fascist nation. And there were two fascist nations that, of the three, there were two fascist nations that had been defeated in World War II. Now, of course, there are 50 fascist nations in the world, and it's a little bit more difficult to defeat the dominant energy of this world right now, which is heading back toward fascism. In any case, what happened was that consciousness was developing these struggles. Between 1960, the sit-in movement took place, and 61, the freedom rides took place. A lot of young whites and blacks participated in these freedom rides that drove people into the South to break segregation. In 1963 and 1965, there were major mass demonstrations in San Francisco that drew young people. Many of them were working class, or people just coming out of the military, or just coming up from the Deep South, who congealed, who came together around struggles here in the Bay Area. Tremendous outgrowth that was taking place. Well, as they retreated from the activities, from the demonstrations, from the arrests, from victories and from defeats, some of them retreated back into the college life, because the fastest growing industry in this country in the mid-1960s was the higher education industry. And so a lot of people were getting into college, and college was cheap. In fact, I think that if I counted all the money that I paid in all the time I was in college, it might have been $300. Should I say that again? $300. That was big money at that time, but $300. Of course, I didn't pay anything for my master's, PhD law degree. Free. Have you heard of any madness like that? Well, why? That was because there was a drive and a need to educate large sectors of young populations, because the United States had replaced the Western European powers, or the European powers, as the consummate power, the preeminent power on earth. And they had to have an educated sector who could go out and administer the new power, the dominant power, the new imperial power on the planet. So they brought in people, and they essentially paid for young people to attend school. In California, they devised a caste system so that they could replicate and duplicate the private schools like USC and Stanford. So UC Berkeley became the Stanford, and that's where a small group of 2% of the top 2% of the students who graduated from high school never paid a dime to go to school. The second layer was the state colleges like San Francisco State, where they were going to train the technocrats and the school teachers. And almost anybody could go to those, but they needed to have a good layer of young whites who could come in, because, of course, they were going to engineer all and administer all the projects that were going to take place out in the world. And then the community colleges for the rest of us. That's how the structure was laid out in 1960. But they made a couple of holes. They made a couple of the state of California said they needed to have two groups of people that they can allow in who couldn't make the grade to take those exams, all those college exams. I mean, the CAT, they still do the CAT? The college aptitude tests, the SAT, yeah, all of those. Totally racist, totally eugenicist, totally. So they already set it up so that they could block out a whole set of people who didn't have a background in golf or tennis, so that you were going to lose and then think you were a loser. So you didn't have to try to get into the top echelons. You would just stick at the bottom. In any case, all this began to break down during the time of the between 1960 and 1965. At San Francisco State, a group of young whites led by Jim Nixon, who was Richard Nixon's nephew, in a liberal organization of students. In spring of 1965, they won the election to run the Associated Students. Associated Students at that time controlled their own funds because during those times, of course, students, if they were going to have activities, it was going to be basketball and football and dances and pom-pom girls and eating goldfish and panty raids, etc. So students were in control of their own finances because they weren't going to do very much. This is what they were going to do what students had always done. However, a remarkable thing took place. 3 women, Cynthia Carlson, Donna Michelson, and Sharon Gold, approached Jim Nixon during the summer of 1965 about doing something a little bit different. Why don't we establish a separate order, a separate way of educating that was different from the formal education, and see if we could get faculty members to sponsor us? And Jim Nixon, because he fell for Cynthia Carlson, went for it. Cynthia Carlson was a tsunami. She came into San Francisco State, and her basic thing was, you got 97% male teachers. 97% of them were white. There aren't any women teachers. So I want to teach myself. So she set up her own class. Sharon Gold taught a class that fall of '65 on anti-racism. And Donna Michelson was one of those people who was early in the anti-war movement. She taught a class. That was all experimental college was. See if it would happen. So they got college sponsors, a little space, and they opened up. And they had 3 classes, and they had 170 enrollees into the classes. So all the classes had more than 50 students. In the spring of 1966, they decided to double the size and number of classes, to 6. It ended up being about 8, but they wanted to double the numbers. I taught 2, because I had just come in and just become a student. But I had a number of years as an organizer in the civil rights movement both in the South and in Los Angeles. So I taught 2 classes. There was a class taught called Black Nationalism, and a guy by the name of Tom Ramsey taught a class on community organizing. He was a follower of one of the icons at that time. His name was Saul Alinsky. So those were the number of classes. But so many students were interested in being a part of this. So here's the development. You have this growth, this tremendous interest by students in teaching other students on the assumption that no student, just like no faculty, was a bank of knowledge. So that's the thrust of it. The shift in the EC, in the experimental college, was a shift from attending sessions where one person has all the knowledge and the others sit and try to absorb that, versus everyone has the capacity to share the knowledge they have, and if they don't have it, they can go find it and bring it to the group. That was the shift. the other thing was the search for some order, some culture other than the one that was laid out. So they had a number of heroes at that time. Paul Goodman had wrote a book called Growing Up Absurd. Betty Friedan had written a book called The Feminine Mystique, which was about is it possible for women universally to leave the house and go and seek jobs so that they could be independent. Of course, black women didn't have to do that because the largest market in the black community, the people who were employed were largely black women. So that feminine mystique didn't apply to them. But we read the books anyway. So I'm just going to go through a few of these books. These people. Ivan Ilyich, Deschooling Society, A.S. Neil Summer. What's important? These are kind of boring, laid out things now. They're not important now. But in those days, those books, those tomes, challenged the existing order of conformity. And so the idea was, here were young white people who were trying to figure out, how can we challenge this existence? Now, they represent the great power on earth, and they were challenging it. Herbert Marcuse, who wrote a book called One-Dimensional Man. Eric Fromm. C. Wright Mills, who challenged the order by coming out with a book called The Power Elite. All of these dynamics were taking place in the learning circle. So people were reading these books, and they were using these books as a means to challenge the social order. The other thing that was striking, aside from the fact that contraception shifted its power base from men to women, because in this 1960s was the beginning of the pill and foams, so that women had more control over the reproductive process. That was a serious breach, because then women could not only say yes, they could say yes and protect themselves, or they could say no. But it was no longer the prophylactic. Again, you guys, this is way out of you guys' arena. But in 1964, 65, to restore women to their prior place of being wards of the state as long as they are able to give birth. So that's the law in the state of Texas, that women are the wards of the state and should have no power over their bodies. Well, this struggle took place in the 1960s, where women actually got into the battle of taking responsibility for their own well-being. That's what we're talking about when we hear people say that they should not have ever had that right, that power, because what it did was replace men as the controller of the process. Uh-oh. I'm sorry. Then there were social and cultural icons like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Fidel and Che, etc. All of these came into play in all of this. One of the most crucial components of the ideological shift that took place in the 1960s was the Catholic Church. Pope John the 23rd, Pope John Paul VI did a revolution in the church where they pushed for members of the church to move out, not to just deal with the flock that was inside the temple, but to move outside the temple and become involved in the sociological shift in the world. And the cultural changes were profound. The nuns went from wearing these habits that enclosed their entire bodies to wearing tennis shoes and long skirts. Women who had heretofore not been active, were not supposed to play an active role in political and social leadership, were then shifted to be trained in leadership. Tell you how important that was. The next stage, when I came to San Francisco State in 1966, I came with a program that came out of SNCC. The program was simple. We want to take the university and use it as a tool, as a beachhead to recruit numbers of black people, bring them on the campus, train them, instill them with a certain kind of political point of view, and then send them out in the community to spend the rest of their lives in service to the people. Protracted struggle, we were talking about all of that. When we came into the experimental college, the thrust of the experimental college from the whites were they need to do a lot of interpersonal searching and shifts in the culture and how they could play a greater part in the culture and move it to a place that was more humane. And what we wanted to do was to overthrow the government under the leadership of black people and establish a socialist country. Can you see the difference? So we viewed our job as this. We want to make Black Student Union a model. And the model would look like this. We would seize every piece of low-hanging fruit that existed on the campus, take that over and use it as a means to recruit, train, and transmit young people into the community to serve the community. The low-hanging fruit was the associated students. That included the experimental college. That included the community involvement program. That included the tutorial program. Again, 3 women came and got me. I was arguing with white folks about putting this project into place, white students, when Joanne Mitchell, Vanetta McGee, and Patricia Rivera came over to me, and I'm in the middle of an argument, and said, we need to talk. They are the reason there was a Black Student Union, because they saw the potential. They saw what I was talking about as a certain set of goals. They recognized that their own ongoing organization, the Negro Students Association, which was a place where people could hear things and talk, was not going to be a movement, an aggressive, assertive movement, and you needed to put that together, and that's what happened. What happened was that we met together, a group of about 6 or 7 of us, and we met with the chair of that organization, whose name was Mariana Wadi, who is the person who's central to all that development. And we pulled together the various black factions on the campus and formed what became the Black Student Union. But the Black Student Union's job was, the first thing we did was take over the tutorial program. Second thing we did was take over the community organizing program. And the third thing we did was to join, we tasked Mariana Wadi to set up something called the Black Arts and Culture Series. She went into the experimental college with the purpose of trying to seize as much of the assets, the resources, because that's what we want to do. The experimental...
Sorry.
That's all right.
Sorry, I was just...
We'll wait it out.
You forgot really quick.
We saw ourselves as, the experimental college saw itself as seizing the resources of the institutions so that they could develop themselves internally. And we saw ourselves as seizing those same resources to develop movements and struggles within the black community so that we can ameliorate our situation. And that's basically what was going to be at loggerheads, but initially we worked very closely together. That went on for about a year and a half. And then by the next spring, the experimental college had about peaked. Its leadership had reached about as far as it could go. They did something that we did not do. That is, they didn't see themselves as replicating people who had the same point of view. So when those 3 women who were the dynamic forces of the experimental college, Donna Michelson, Cynthia now Nixon, and Sharon Gold, left the campus, well, replaced them with young men who were very much better at organizing or organization, but not good at vision. They were not visionaries. A fundamental object of the Black Student Union was to train and prepare visionaries. That is, we wanted people to develop to the point where they could spend the rest of their lives in service. So they had to have a vision about that service. They had to have a point of view. They had to have a sense of the long struggle. So by spring of 1967, the Black Student Union had evolved. We had brought Leroy Jones and his wife and Sonia Sanchez, and they had served to enhance our cultural work. We had moved from 2 or 3 courses to 8, and then 12, and then 17. We had convinced the administration and the academic senate to accept our proposal for a Black Studies and Community Work Program. Let me say that again. Black Studies and Community Work Program. Black Studies we saw it as an insurgency. It was not designed to be on a campus. It was designed to be shared, where 40% of the activity takes place on the campus and 60% takes place in the community. That was the original dream, the original goal of Black Studies, was to be a largely community-based program. So at Stanford, they put together a Black House on the campus. At San Francisco State, we put a Black House on Fillmore. That I'm trying to explain to you is the difference. The difference is that whatever new apparatus we set up, we geared it much more toward preparation for the benefit of the whole. We weren't interested in people building their own individual legacies. We were interested in the legacy of the community, the evolution of that. And I'm telling you, the Mexican American, or what we call the Chicano community at that time, bought right into it. The leadership bought right into it. The various people who are now called Asian and Pacific Islander bought right into it. They could see, that group of people could see that possibility, that dynamic, and that's what we pushed. So the unity that we had was not simply around something is wrong with white people. Our unity was around building our own positive dynamic. The other point I wanted to make that's not clear, in most of the early Black studies and all of the early experimental college courses, the Black courses were almost always at least 50% non-Black. So that when the strike took place, not only did we have an educated, politically educated, and a culturally strong group of non-whites, we also had a similar dynamic among whites because they had been exposed for some people for 2 and 3 years to that history and that culture. And interestingly enough, they may have felt embarrassed by it initially, but they didn't feel embarrassed. As DeSantis says, he doesn't want his children to be embarrassed by learning that his grandparents were setting up picnics to lynch Black people. He didn't want his children to be uncomfortable. What we discovered and what we learned was that whites, if they stick to it, learn not only to be comfortable, they learn how to be human beings in a setting where they are not the dominant force. And that didn't take away from their humanity, it enhanced their humanity. Last piece I'll run is this. There was a split. By this time, there was a split in the relationship between the experimental college. The experimental college in spring and then later in the fall of 1967 was moving much more toward counterculture. Jim Nixon became involved in the psychedelic side of counterculture, and he was one of the founders. there were a number of counterculture activities on the campus, which black people, Black Student Union, supported. We supported anything that challenged, raised challenges and programs. So on the campus came the Grateful Dead. These are people you never heard of before. Grateful Dead, Big Brother in the Holding, Big Brother in the Holding.
Yeah, with Janis Joplin.
Yes. All those folks came to the campus during those times because that was the draw. But the shift over time was back to Haight-Ashbury. So the hate became the center. What happened was that the experimental college had created its own contradiction, its own reason to go away. Whereas with the Black Student Union and Black Studies, we had gone from one Black Student Union, or 3 or 4, to 30. There were Black student unions in Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada. They were spreading all over the country. And all of them wanted to use that kind of model of training and preparation for long-term struggle. So that the direction, the logic of the direction was that there was no way we were going to stay together if you are not replicating your leadership, A, and B, you're moving away from, there's only going to be one center, and that's Haight-Ashbury, whereas our thing was the center of our work was wherever black people were, or wherever Chicanos were, or wherever people from various Asian communities were. And that was the unit, that was what built or created the circumstances where there could be a Third World Liberation Front unity in support of the Black Student Union, because we worked every day with everyone to see if we could create a circumstance, a model for that training and effort. We did the same thing with SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, and the Progressive Labor Party, who thought that we were crazy because we weren't practicing for the immediate overthrow of the government. We were doing reformist stuff, and what I've said for the last, 50 years is that everything that the Black Panther Party did was reformist. You could call it revolutionary, but it was all reformist. The breakfast program is reformist. But that's the same thing that Amilcar Cabral did in Guinea-Bissau. It's the same thing that Mao did in the Long March. It's all right to do reform if you got a program. So whatever, you can call it whatever you like. And of course, the leaders who still survive of the Progressive Labor Party, Communist Party, the kind of Maoist communist parties of that time, have all become insurance executives or are big in the tech industry, or so they kind of gave it up. Whereas people like myself, as my mother said, you're never going to be any more than half housebroken. And that's probably the case. It hasn't gotten any better for me. I mean, my behavior has not gotten any better. And my friends and associates, like Ray Tompkins and Paul Lee here, who my chief researcher, and Craig, this guy here is, boy, if you want to learn, this is a guy to teach. My wife, we're all involved in some kind of reclamation or development for humankind. And that's my work with Mark, your professor here, is trying to engender that about the past. We're still moving at that. We're still moving at that level. So the work of the experimental college was positive work. And there's need for experimental college, although it's very difficult now because experimental college in 1960s developed at the end of an undeveloped and immature fascism. Right now, we're at the end of a period of enlightenment and moving deeply into a period of potential fascism. So the work will be harder, and I don't envy you for that work. But the work has to be done. There needs to be several citers. There needs to be several challenges. There's a lot of work that has to be done. But the people who started the experimental college and ended up with thousands of students from the Black Student Union, created the first new field of study in this country, in academia, in the last 50, 60 years, were between the ages of 16 and 25. We were between the leadership of the Black Student Union averaged 20 years of age. Hello? The leadership was averaged 20 years of, we were all students, as Jerry Vernado Presente had said. We weren't hoodlums, we weren't thugs, we just were students. But we saw that the most important part of our educations, the most important deed that we could do with whatever knowledge we had, was to advance humanity, to advance the status of the people, and particularly to advance the status of our constituency. Thank you very much. Enjoy.
For the slides.
Enjoy.
Okay. All right. We have some slides. I'll make those available to everyone who's on our sign-in sheet here, as well as multiple other places.
We can do it during the discussion. It's not a problem.
Perfect. Excellent. We have 2 other speakers to get to. I want to make sure that we get to them. I think next up is Jim Willems, who came at the very end of Experimental College. So thank you so much for that history. I'm going to turn it over to Jim Willems. Let me see here. Jim, if you make sure you unmute yourself.
Yeah, I can just start talking. We can forget the picture. Okay. All right. I want to start out by just recognizing and having all of us, if we didn't get a chance to acknowledge it. One of the reasons why the eloquent presentation we just heard points towards a leader that was consistently powerful during the 60s and middle 70s at San Francisco State. Dr. Garrett, we knew him as Jimmy Garrett in those days, just really brought things together. He was an incredibly powerful figure. And his pick and shovel work in terms of the history of the EC starting up is accurate, as far as I'm concerned. Okay, let me do a little bio before I go into 67, 68, and 69. I was brought on campus because Ian Grand, who inherited the leadership of the experimental college from that cadre that Dr. Garrett talked about, went to a conference in Davis with the Panthers and others about experimental education, and I gave a speech. I was studying at the time with Herbert Marcuse, a name that was mentioned by Dr. Garrett. I was an anarcho-communist, hardcore organizer, and he brought me onto campus because he was afraid that the experimental college didn't have enough political activism in it. And so that observation, again, by Dr. Garrett is accurate. I went ahead and worked there, and then I worked after the experimental college with Los Siete, which is a Latino power in the Mission. And then Benny Stewart and Jerry Vernardo had me work in North of Market in the Tenderloin with Runaways. And then I worked with the Nicaraguans during their revolution. Then I worked with Manning Marable and Moses Kenyatta and the Jesse Jackson campaign in the 80s. And worked in Grenada after the US invasion with the young people there, putting together a program, a socialist program to try to help them out. And then in the 90s and the early part of this this century, I worked with the experimental college, not experimental college, East Bay Meditation Center in Oakland, which is the first Buddhist center in the United States run by BIPOC people and LGBTQ people. So I've seen a lot of different permutations of leadership, and I've always worked in organizations where people of color were in charge, because that's what white people should do. That's just what we should do. All right. When Ian brought me in 67, Dr. Garrett was right. Things were changing. The courses went up to as many as 100 courses with 10,000 people on campus. The courses included, and the course that was always made fun of was the Indigenous Peoples Basket Weaving course. It wasn't made fun of by Indigenous people, but it was made fun of at the leadership level in terms of the trustees. There was a guerrilla warfare course given by Roberto Kofke, which became famous and hit the newspapers. Turned out later Roberto Kofke was an agent of the CIA. We had courses on I think almost every major political and religious movement going. I mean, the Trots on campus had their own courses. Sam Burkholz, who founded Shambhala Books, a Buddhist publishing center, ran his first course on Tibetan Buddhism there. So a lot of people got started in that countercultural thing that Dr. Garrett was talking about. And it, I would say, I would generalize it differently than he did. It wasn't a problem. I think it was an adventure in interiority. That everything in the 50s was to pull people into conformity and out of their interior structures of formation into the control of that consciousness by the state, and teaching people to be in charge of their own interiority and how to structure that interiority, how to discipline it, how to explore it. Were the better courses in the experimental college. That was geared around the experience of meditation. And meditation is still controversial with the left. Groups like PL and the SDS, it's an anathema for them, meditation. My experience is, and this is another little biographical thing. I've had cancer. I have a terminal heart disease. Right now I'm talking with COVID, so I'm a little fuzzy. I'm 3 days into an outbreak, which came from a grandchild. So God bless our grandchildren, but they go to school and they bring back to us gifts, and we get to explore those gifts as I am. So yeah, the meditation has taught me how to deal with on a scale of 10 pain that never goes under 7, and be in right relationship to it. So I think meditation is incredibly important. All right, what happened in 67 when I came in? There was a group of mostly white people, and I'll just mention their names because we're recording this, and their names should be mentioned. Tamasita, a guy named Bill Bayless, Ellen Bayless, William Talcott, Carol Talcott, Ian Grand, Steve Dunn, Patty Crawford, Lori Zimmer, and me were on the steering committee then. And we formed something which was kind of radical called the Telos community. And that was based on basic communist grounds, which was that we we took 3 salaries that came from the student body allocations and also from a grant from the Carnegie Foundation, which we got. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. We put together a basic bank, and everybody who is on the steering committee gave us what they needed to get by. And so from we had some who had children, so they got larger allowances, and we supported ourselves with those 3 salaries that came from the grant for 2 years. And it was a radical experience in sharing, and almost no greed was expressed in that. People really learned to sacrifice, but also to trust one another. So it was a high level of trust. Dr. Garrett mentioned Paul Goodman, who founded also a book called Gestalt Therapy, which was a new kind of therapy, and a place called Esalen down on the coast became very famous for those kinds of therapies. Large numbers of students and teachers from San Francisco State went down and had an experience there. It was not a woke experience in terms of the way that term is used, but it was an experience which woke some of them up and made them aware of the structures of their own oppression. And that was important, very important. So Ian knew that there was a strike coming. He had been at George Washington University in St. Louis, had been busted there on a bank demonstration trying to help integrate the staff of a bank, and had been given 3 years probation, and had come out to San Francisco, and he couldn't be arrested again. And if he was arrested, he would be doing 3 years in prison, federal prison. And so he had me as cannon fodder. And I was busted. I was arrested. I did go to jail on several occasions behind the strike, and later on behind Los Siete in the mission community. So when the strike started, the white students got together in Gallery Lounge, which is a myth. Maybe it's a myth that the present students aren't even aware of, but it was a community center, basically, and all of the different white student groups got together and elected a white strike leader. That first white strike leader was me, and I was invited over to the BSU hut. And there, Benny and Terry Collins and Jack Alexis, and I don't know if Dr. Garrett was there. I don't think so. And Nesbitt Crutchfield basically had been summoned, and I used that word on purpose, by Dean Garrity, the vice dean of so-called student affairs and academic dean, and to present their demands. And so they gave me a list of the demands, and for the first time out, sent me over to meet with Garrett to make those demands. I think the most radical demand that was being made was open admission, which meant that anybody that wanted to go to San Francisco State could go to San Francisco State. And if they flunked out the first year, that was their problem. But basically, anybody that applied could come in. That was, I think, the most radical. Are you still there, Dr. Garrett?
Oh, yes.
Don't you think that was pretty radical?
That was fundamental. But the Black Student Union was already doing it. So,
Yeah, no, I mean that open admission for being a student, I think was just really important among all the demands. When I came in, Garrity had my FBI file on his desk, and amazingly, my CIA file. with pictures of me in various demonstrations. So to answer Grace's question, I don't have any pictures of me from those days, but if you do the Freedom of Information Act, you can get lots of them from the CIA and the FBI. So he said, you know, we're not going to listen to the Black students. He was really upfront. This is not going to happen. You can go back and tell him that this is going nowhere. This was not a surprise to the Black students, of course. And Garrity, I don't know how much we're supposed to clean up our language here, but he was a real hole. Let's just leave it at that. He was just a bad person. He'd been a warden in the prison system before he came to San Francisco State. His mentality was a prison mentality. That's what he thought college was for, was to discipline and properly organize the consciousness of the students there. It was to make Black people safe. It was to make everybody safe and tools. So that group of students that Dr. Garrett talked about that went to the state college system would be good tools of the ruling class. Most of them wouldn't become ruling class, but they would be semi-affluent. I mean, comfortable, let's put it that way, comfortable flunkies. And I went back and reported, and at that point, meetings were held in various places and demonstrations began. And what was it like? I mean, one of the things that we had that I don't think was mentioned, or it wasn't mentioned here by Dr. Garrett, but it might have been mentioned earlier in some of his other presentations. On campus, there were a series of, looked like World War II structures, almost Quonset hut-like structures that were called the huts. All right, and the hut that we were in had the Black Media organization, and that had Eddie Washington and what was Oscar's last name, Dr. Garrett? Do you remember?
Who?
Oscar. And
Oscar Williams.
Oscar Williams, thank you. Filmmaker, brilliant filmmaker.
Yes.
Eddie Washington is actually up in
Yes.
Canada and is a barrister. They were there under the experimental college, and this was one of the political things that I insisted upon was draft help. And draft help helped a lot of people, regardless of ethnicity, to deal with their draft, either to get 4F'd or to leave the country. And it operated pretty successfully with 3 draft counselors that really knew what they were doing in terms of the draft. I had been drafted earlier in the year and had refused induction in Oakland. That's a separate story, but it was, I was not jailed at that time because they were too lazy. If it was still 68 before they started putting refuseniks in jail. But I basically said I will not go to Vietnam and kill and participate in a civil war. I won't do that. We don't belong there. And yeah, and so we lived in those huts basically with eventually as many as 5,000 cops on campus running around with batons, beating the hell out of people. And the people that were in the programs, African-American students, Black students, and other students would run into the huts, and for some reason the cops never came into those huts, so we were safe there. And there was a Lutheran center across the street from that students would hide in as well when the cops were going. I still remember all of the chants and the huge, and I hope that Dr. Garrett brought some of the film from that. There was actually a movie made by a Black filmmaker about the strike. I don't know what happened to that movie. I saw it once. It was a wonderful movie. Do you know about that one, Dr. Garrett?
Yeah, I have some stuff that we were going to show at the end.
Okay, good. Yeah, it's a great movie. I guess one point of divergence for me in terms of history would be the role of Roger Alvarado in the strike. Roger was an El Salvadoreño. He was a leader for the Latinx population on campus, and a lot of the other ethnicities also were attracted to him, and he was calling what he was doing the Third World Liberation Front. So that must have been a proto group for what later became what Dr. Garrett is describing as the Third World Liberation Front. But I remember it with the Asian American Alliance. Yes. And the other groups that all saw themselves relating to that, and that group strongly supported the Black students and saw themselves in solidarity with it. And Roger made a lot of press conferences where he released statements about brown and non-Black, but people of color approaches to this activity. And I think that what was important, and I think the saddest thing for me about this whole business is we came really, really close. I mean, Dr. Garrett's right. Some of the white students were formed into a really conscious relationship to oppression and to BIPOC people. And the state really came down hard, and it got lost. That unity got lost. And it's almost like we're having to recreate all of that work over again. And I weep because of that. I mean, there's, I'm glad we still have Garrett and others who are here to tell these stories, and me for that matter. But, I'm dying. I'm not going to be around that long. And I'm hoping you guys hear enough here that you feel that moving it, identity politics is penultimate, ultimately. We've got to move towards an image of unity because that's the states, the capitalist state wants to divide and conquer. And it wants to do that with every group there is. I mean, all you have to do is read W.E. Du Bois to understand how that force works and has worked in the Black community. And you could do the same thing in other ethnic communities as well, in terms of divide and conquer. And so we've got to find a dialectic that keeps us together long enough that we can seriously challenge. Because I'm a socialist too, brother, and we need to do that in this country, because what's happening is that capitalism is killing the planet. It's killing life. It's anti-life. It's not just anti-people. It's anti-life, and it's a protracted, long struggle. I mean, the Nicaraguan party I belonged to was the Prolonged Guerra faction, which in Spanish just means the prolonged war faction. It was the faction which unfortunately didn't win. Ortega turned out to be a tool of capitalism, and now Nicaragua is dealing with those contradictions and doing the same kind of oppression now in terms of fascism that this country's doing. So that's tragedy. Those 50 countries Dr. Garrett talked about, that's the tragedy. Those are the places where it's getting deep. But also there are lots of examples in the world now of young people like you guys. It's even happening in China, are resisting and are organizing to free themselves. I'm just claiming that part of the freedom is an interior dialectic as well as an exterior dialectic. And the mistake that Marxism made is not to understand the proper role for consciousness, that consciousness is not secondary to matter. It is primary in its relationship to matter. That's a long philosophical thing, and I don't need to get into that. I've taught that before at the university level.
Mr. Williams, I hate to cut you off.
I did. What happened?
Tomasita Nadal. Is that all right with you?
Someone's what? You.
Tomasita is next to talk. Is that all right with you? Are you ready?
Yeah, that's okay. I've said enough. If you need to have Tomasita talk.
You've got everything I think for you.
But thank you, everybody. Thank you for listening.
And we see the FB last 10 minutes, so you all hang out. Great. Well, all right, Tomasita, no.
Hello, hello, everyone, brothers and sisters. Can you hear me?
We're trying to.
Yes? Okay. I'm Tomasita Medal. I'm of Nicaraguan descent. My parents came here from Nicaragua, and my father on his deathbed, when I was a very little, like 20 months old, he asked my great auntie to raise me, and she was a traditional indigenous woman, and she was very strict. She was born January 1st in 1900, so she was, it was like I was being raised in Nicaragua in the 1920s, and I love it. And so I want to just say it's really beautiful to see so many people of different ages and different ethnicities here. And I'm really glad I gather you're taking ethnic studies, and I just want to share a little bit. When I first came to the campus in 1966, the only students of color, I mean, my parents had, my mother and my great auntie worked 2 jobs, and well, my auntie was a nurse, so she just worked 1 job, and my mother worked 2 jobs, and they sent me to, St. Anne's School and St. Rose Academy. So I had a very good education. And when I was being tormented by the white kids, I was chubby and I had long braids, and I was traditional. And my mother and my great auntie looked like they were straight off the boat because they always wore scarves tied under their neck, like they do in Nicaragua at a time when the white people were wearing, their hair was in bubbles, and it was coming out, in the 50s, it was coming out of it was at the time when people were very conformist. So the white kids picked on me, and I don't want to talk about me at this point. I want to talk about what happened when I went to college. I'm just explaining that I was one of the few Raza people who didn't, who was on campus, who was not a wealthy Latina foreign student, because when I came to the campus in 1966, the only people, the majority, the great majority of the people of color on the campus were wealthy foreign students from Africa and from Latin America. They were not homegrown San Franciscans, because we still had the tracking system going on in the public schools, during which if you have your teacher in grammar school would determine whether you should take college prep classes in high school, or if you were destined to be a mechanic. And so all the kids of color got pushed into classes that would not give them the credits from high school to get into a college. And so I mean, I know for people who were told, you're suited to be a car mechanic, and so that's also like 60% or more of the students in the public schools in San Francisco were non-white, but only 6% of the students at San Francisco State were non-white. And like I said, they were mostly wealthy foreign students. And so my memory of the experimental college is a little different from the preceding people, because I came in around that time afterwards. I came in around 60, 1997 or somewhere in there. I'm a little fuzzy on years, but the point being that the experimental college, what I remember is that the idea was that people had everybody's experience. There were people who had a body of knowledge that was not necessarily recognized by the academy. We'll say like someone who was a karate master or a real community organizer. People have bodies of knowledge that didn't come from the academy. And let's remember that the academy, what I mean by that, I mean the higher education system was established in these continents by the invading missionaries, the invading the Jesuits and these occupying forces. And so anything that's the university is it's a descendant of colonialism and the way that, they burned all the books of the Mayans to burn the evidence of this high civilization that they came and destroyed the evidence of. And they went, they brought the Inquisition to this land, to this continent. They brought the Inquisition, they brought torture, rape, pillage, theft, and you know what? It's going on even today in Nicaragua this week. In the last 3 months, there's been all these indigenous villages burned to the ground by the white colonizers that are trying to seize the land of the Mayagna people. And I've tried to get help, and if anybody can figure out or wants to form a committee to help the Mayagna people of Nicaragua, I'm just one disabled elder, and I don't know where to go. If anyone has any ideas, I'd love to get help with that. But anyways, so the experimental college introduced the idea that you didn't have to have a PhD to have enough knowledge of anything to share. And so anybody with a body of knowledge that they felt was valuable could teach, and anybody who wanted to learn could sign up for it, and it was free. That was the idea. But what my experience at the experimental college, I didn't know, the part what Dr. Garrett was talking about before when I came into it. Was that I was there. I was a student, so it must have been in '66. There was a progressive slate, and then Russell Bass was running for president. And like Jimmy said, there were before that the Associated Students money, which mind you was $10 for every student. So that's a lot of money, and that was the Associated Student budget. And so it had been just used for like the pom-pom girls and the sororities and the fraternities. And then Russell Bass ran on a platform to establish 5 areas of service. We would use the associated funds to establish 5 areas of service. And the service, what was founded was draft help, the Black Film Institute, the community services organization, and the tutorial program and the experimental college. And for example, Eddie Washington was the founder pretty much of the Black Film Institute and the tutorial program. And his concept was that it would be better for Black students to tutor the little kids in the Black community, and for the Latino students like myself to tutor the Latino students, so that there wouldn't be this kind of missionary attitude where it would be white students tutoring everybody. It would be everyone to tutor in their own community so that the students would be comfortable with the person that was tutoring them. That was the revolutionary idea that Eddie Washington came up with regarding tutoring. Roger Alvarado worked for the Community Organizing Institute, of which Sharon Gold was the executive director. And I worked as the secretary of the experimental college next door to the Community Organizing Institute, and then there was draft help. So Roger and I would go down, since we were the few raza on campus, we would go down to the Lake Merced. I was just a kid, right? I was like 17 or 18, because I know I started when I graduated when I was 17, but anyway. So we would go down Lake Merced, he would try to give me a political teaching, and anyways, so what was going on was there were no teachers of color on campus whatsoever, except for one. He wasn't even a teacher of color, but the guy who taught the history of Latin America was a retired executive from Standard Oil. And he's also the guy who taught the Spanish class. You know, that was the state of affairs when I walked on campus in 1966. It was, you know, like was said, there was no faculty of color, and there were very few students of color, except for these wealthy foreign students. And so, but this whole country was in turmoil. You know, there was a high energy because people's sons were being drafted, people were being forced to go to war without their consent to kill people who like Muhammad Ali said, you know, had done them no harm, and they're being forced to go kill. And so the whole country was on high alert because only people who had the money to go to school could get a draft deferment because they were students. And so it was just, so that's what this, so the consciousness was high because it was, everybody was being affected by it, by the draft. And anyway, I know we're short on time, so I want to see what Dr. Garrett brought and Jim brought. So my message is, if you notice, we had the attitude of the education, the college education is for us to develop our minds to be of service to our community for life, you know, to serve our community and to serve the world for life. And I am distressed and saddened. Please, everybody turn off your mic, please. So whoever's got your sound up. Anyways, because now, you know, when we founded the College of Ethnic Studies, jumping way ahead, there was a strike, and the strike came about because of what we're talking about. That there was nothing that we could relate to. In like, for example, I took psychology. In the psychology class, the teacher said, there's positions of power. You know, the bus driver is the one with the power, and then the people who don't have the power are the ones, you know, sitting in the bus. And and then you have the big country, the important countries, you know, they're the ones that have the power, and they kind of help the little countries. And then I raised my hand and said, well, no, isn't it that the little countries are the ones that support the big countries because all the resources and labor comes from the little countries. So he got enraged because I didn't agree with him. And I found that in taking classes from white instructors that they would grade me according to whether I agreed with what they said, not by, you know, the excellence of my examination of the subject matter. And so there was definitely a need for classes that told the story of the people of color, you know, from our viewpoint and taught by our own people. And because you're a person of color and you walk in those days, I don't know what it is like now, but you walk into a classroom and the teacher's white, they immediately have their racist, you know, baggage that comes into play when they see you. Whereas if you go into a College of Ethnic Studies class, that's your brethren right there. You know, the teacher loves you and you love the teacher, and you're comfortable and you can learn and you can learn the truth. And what's happened with ethnic studies is that they've done a study that showed that anybody who takes an ethnic studies class, white or anybody of any color, as long as they take at least one ethnic studies class, they have a greater chance of graduating, because for the first time in their life, they're hearing the truth, right? I mean, I'm sure you're experiencing that, you're hearing other viewpoints that you've never heard while you're being inculcated with the Western European Anglo-Judaic context. And so, so that's why it's so precious to take so-called ethnic studies classes. But for example, La Raza, we at the time, we named ourselves La Raza organization because the menfolk were all, the leadership were talking to one another, Roger Alvarado and the members of the BSU Central Committee, because what happened was that we organized, there were these different organizations on campus that, like the Latin American Student Organization, and they had, before this all came about, there were like kind of social clubs, you know, the Asian American for collegiate, the Filipino Americans for collegiate endeavor, et cetera. But then as the consciousness grew, the clubs were no longer social clubs, but then they became with the idea of like tutoring in the community, working with youth. And so the idea was to use our education that we were getting to serve the community, each of our own respective communities. And so one day at the Latin American Student Organization meeting, Roger came in and said, we are forming a Third World Liberation Front, and we're going to have to merge with the Mexican American Student Confederation because there can only be one Raza organization. Well, La Raza, the term, it means, it refers to a concept that was introduced into the intellectual atmosphere of the time, which is a concept that I learned from Dr. Raymond Noble in a Black Studies class, Black contribution to scientific development. And he says that sometimes there's a book or a concept that gets introduced in a speech, and then it disseminates around the world and it changes the consciousness. And anyways, so I'm losing my train of thought here. So the third world, I want to share with all the youngsters who haven't heard this. Back in those days, the big powers were Russia and the United States. And so the first world is it's like the Western European sphere of influence and the Soviet sphere of influence. That's the first world. And the third world, I forgot what the second world is. But anyway, the third world is all the people of color exploited by the first two worlds. I guess the first one is the US and Western Europe, and then the second world is Soviets. And then the third world is Africa, everything south of the border, it seems, like the indigenous peoples of the world, or the indigenous cultures and countries of the world. So that's where the term third world comes from. And so he came in and told us we're forming a third world liberation front. And our organization, LASO, Latin American Student Organization, and Mexican American Student Federation, is going to merge into La Raza. And he explained to us that La Raza is a term that was introduced into the world by a Mexican philosopher in the 1920s. It's called, the book was La Raza Cósmica, and it postulated that there's a new race on Earth, this new cosmic race that is the result of the invasion by the people of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, to this continent, plus the combination of the African people that were brought here. So it's Iberian plus indigenous. That's the important thing, because the indigenous people of the continent, the term La Raza, what binds us is our indigenous blood, no matter whether we're from Peru or we're from Colombia or from Mexico or Nicaragua. That's the concept of La Raza. So that's the most progressive term to use. I detest the term Latinx. It reminds me of Kleenex, and what's happened there is that as time has gone by, people have forgotten to honor and be grateful for and celebrate their indigenous ancestry. So we've gone through, and people have become much more self-involved. So now people come to college, and instead of training themselves and understanding that they're there to learn how to be an instrument of service to the community, instead they're coming here and looking at their belly button and saying, well, call me, there and them and me and I. And so it has become a very self-involved community, where the student community is it gets all into themselves when they come to college, instead of using their education and having the consciousness to use their education to develop their mind as an instrument of service to the world and to the community, and to the respective communities. So I would like to tell those of you who are here to give you a reminder from voice from the past, that consider the idea of using your education to hone your brain and your body to be an instrument of service, rather than getting distracted from your education by getting too much off in other words, get over yourselves. To those who are just like obsessing over themselves, that's not what education is supposed to be. It's supposed to develop yourself for the higher good. Or that's our viewpoint, and I think that's the founding people's viewpoint, and that's why we called it Third World Liberation Front, because we're trying to liberate everybody of color, what they call BIPOC now, but that was Third World back then, to to liberate us and to help to liberate our people. So I wanted to just say that at the end of all this, I have a BA in La Raza Studies, and thank God for the fact that because of Native American Studies classes I took, I did get introduced to what white people call the sweat lodge, but the traditional, prayer ways, which I had been looking for all my life. And goodness, I found it right here at San Francisco State. And so you can go, there's people, talking, I don't even know what dialectic means, but, there's intellectualizations, which is what I consider all these theories, like, Marx and all those guys. They're Jewish people, like who analyze the world in a way so it wouldn't put blame on white people, and that they would analyze it according to economics, so that they would be shielded from guilt. But beyond that is your own traditional knowledge, the knowledge that you get from your parents and your grandparents and the elders in your community. And I urge people to, a college education is fine, that's great, but the greatest teachers you have are your mother, your father, your uncles, your aunties, your grandparents, and your elders in your community. So do not take them for granted. Spend as much time as you can learning, asking your any elders that are in your family. What is their story? Like, spend time with them. We have a saying in Nicaragua. Pegados con saliva. Pasted with friendships that are pasted with saliva, because it's not blood, and it's just, people come and go in your life. That's wonderful. But you have so much of a wealth back in your own community. Like if your folks are from the South, make a trip to the South, meet your relatives, learn from your loved ones, from your own community, because that's where that's very, very valuable knowledge, information. And the other thing I like to say is the value of let's see, the value of music, dance, non-colonial food. Okay, so if you get into your culture, I'm fortunate to be indigenous, and so I am, I'm a long time member of a Aztec dance group here in San Francisco, after I became disabled to dance, and I was a drummer for a long time, but then now I'm very, very disabled, so I can't even stand up to drum. But everybody has their own culture, and you can become a cultural worker, and it saves us. Culture saves us, and introduce the children to music and to dance. And it doesn't matter what kind, all kinds of dance is good, all kinds of music is good, as long as a child has a chance for their muse to express itself. And so make sure that all the children that you can help to get somehow to get opportunities to dance and to sing, to play music, give it to them. And then when it comes to colonial food, I'm just amazed at all the illness that there is in this country. And if you watch TV, there's one ad after another for all these illnesses, but they're really caused by the poison of the capitalist system puts into the food. Let me put it this way: if Mother Earth is alive, indigenous cultures understand that Mother Earth is alive, because Mother Earth, let's put it this way: if you put a child up against a naked dead woman, the baby can suck on a breast all they want. They're not going to get any nutrition from it because it's a dead body. So if the entire world, all the people on Earth, get their sustenance from Mother Earth, then she must be alive. Okay, so if you eat an apple, that came directly from Mother Earth. It's transmuted through the roots of the tree, but the essence of Mother Earth, the life force, you're getting it from something that the Mother Earth produced directly. So if you eat something like beans or something that was planted into Mother Earth and you eat that directly, then you're getting the sustenance from Mother Earth. But like everything else that the capitalism do, is they monetize everything. So then they manage a way of, instead of you eating a bowl of amaranth in the morning, or they have these cereals that are full of chemicals and full of sugar, and they just want to make money off it. So it's much cheaper to eat natural food, and preferably organic food, than it is to buy all this stuff in packages that poisons you and will kill you, like stuff that has salt and sugars, and it's not real food. So it's another way of resisting, is to eat healthy, organic, natural food, because then you're taking care of your body and you're not getting sucked into what the ads want you to buy and to eat, because there's a profit in it if you eat the poison food. So that's part of decolonizing yourself. And so I wish you all the best, and thank you for taking ethnic studies. There were people, 800 people were arrested in the course of the 5 months of the strike. One guy, he was visiting from Ohio. He was just standing on the library steps, and the cops rushed, because every day we would have a demonstration at noon, and then the cops would encircle us and rush us. And these cops just ran up and just hit his ribs, and they did the same thing to him like they did to Dolores Huerta. They ruptured his spleen by breaking his ribs. And so it costs a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to get a College of Ethnic Studies, and please do not take it for granted. And if you have a choice, to fulfill a requirement, please take it in ethnic studies. And if you're one ethnicity, if you're Asian American, take a Black Studies class, take a Native American Studies. If you're Native American, take a La Raza class. And I'm very sorry, like I said, the people who have come after us, they had, without any kind of showing of respect, they changed the name of La Raza Studies. Like it's the latest iteration is what, whatever it is. It's not La Raza Studies, and La Raza celebrated our indigenousness. That's a non-colonial value. And so what they've done now is they've watered it down and changed it to some silliness that has nothing to do with indigenousness. And believe me, that's the reason why La Raza people are persecuted, because they're indigenous. All the people along the border, the so-called immigrants that are just trying to cross over their ancestral land, come up north. It's white people saying, okay, we have the right to tell you, no, you can't cross this border that the Pope created a long time ago. Last thing, the doctrine of discovery was just repealed, or the Pope finally, after 500 years, said the doctrine of discovery is not valid. The doctrine of discovery was an edict put out by a Pope. A Portuguese explorer came to him and said, we saw something, Africa looks good, it's got riches and stuff. So he came out with this doctrine of discovery that said that any white Christian who discovered any land that was inhabited by anybody who was not a white Christian, the white Christian had the right to take that land and kill the people on it and just take it. And so based on that, I mean, that is the basis of the law in the US and in England. And so the Native people have been petitioning the Pope, especially around the 500th anniversary of 1492. There's been this movement to rescind the doctrine of discovery. And it was buried in the news, but it was like 4 days ago that the Pope finally said, he didn't officially rescind it, but he said it was not a good idea. And I hope that official rescinding comes soon. And as far as Hayakawa, he was a professor that had been, he passed as Black when they were rounding up all the Japanese Americans. And so then he was promoted, and he was in the semantics department. And so he was made president when President Smith resigned. And he was a right-wing Republican, and Reagan was a right-wing Republican. So he appointed him as president of the university. And then one day there was a demonstration, and Hayakawa came up to where the speaker was, and he ripped the microphone out of the speaker's hands. And so he got a lot of right-wing people liked him. I hope that answers your question. And thank you very much for giving me this time. Good luck to each and every one of you, and may each and every one of you remember, to keep it up, to keep the fight going for justice for your entire life. It feels good to be at the end of your life and know that you did your best to make things better. Thank you.
All right. For those of you still here, we'll take 20 minutes for questions and answers. We want to take as much time for you all as possible. So what questions do you have? Go ahead. Please direct it to who you'd like to ask as well.
I would like to ask,
This is Tomasita Naval.
and excuse me, Ms. Tomasita, I do apologize if I said that wrong. If you were to give your younger self any kind of advice, what would it be?
If I were to give my younger self any advice?
Yes.
Well, I never had counseling. I don't know. I wasn't meant to be a PhD, but I think that, maybe people can get more respect and have more influence if they get a PhD, but in my case, I was not meant to do that. I was meant to follow the traditional spiritual traditions of my people. And so through Native American studies, I did find the way to fulfill my destiny, which is to be a ceremonial dancer. So I, became, a sun dancer and a spirit dancer and a Aztec dancer. So I used to dance throughout the year because when you dance in ceremony, you help to bring this cosmic forces of the cosmos down to the Mother Earth to help to heal her. And so it's a very sacred thing to do, to be a ceremonial dancer, or even a cultural worker who's a dancer. As long as you're praying while you dance, you're helping to charge up Mother Earth. And so it's giving back to her, and it's a sacred thing to be. So I'm very grateful and content that I found the way to fulfill my destiny of becoming a ceremonial dancer. But it's not, so being a PhD isn't for everyone, but being a PhD does give you a certain amount of credibility. However, part of being a PhD is to kind of make you be able to survive in an academic, go through the ringer to become an academic. And, academia is fine, but it's not everything, and you got to watch out to not operate from the head and operate from the heart, and so the academics who changed the name of our department without asking the founders or those of us who created the department, that's a good example of, people who are on a head trip instead of a heart trip, because their rationale was that having a degree with, let's say, Latina/O studies would be more favorable with people like, with organizations like Harvard that would be looking for who's going to graduate or who's going to come to their school. And I think that the reverse is true. I think that if we had a hip name like we started out with, like whether it's Black Studies or whether it's La Raza Studies, that would actually have more resonance with the people deciding whether a student should come and get a PhD. If you have a degree in La Raza Studies instead of a lame, anyway, so much love to you. You know what? Look me up on Facebook, Tomasita Medal, the picture with the pet wolf and the marimba in it. That's me. Don't pick the one with no picture. Just Facebook friend me out, and I hope I get it. And keep up the communication, because this is a wonderful event. Because we're here, we're dying off. Some of us have already died, and I've never had a chance to hear Dr. Garrett's, what I knew he was a giant, but I didn't know what he had done. I just know that those guys, the Black guys, right before the strike, there were these Black men that were getting together and reading all these books together and having heavy duty discussions. These were brilliant men, and so, what happened at State changed the world. And we were the first College of Ethnic Studies. I don't know if Cal thinks they were, but we were. And, like even Dean Montero says that way back over there at Princeton, when they saw what we were doing, then it inspired them to do similar stuff. And so really it made a difference. You can make a difference. Even one person can make a difference.
Thank you for that. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, even though I didn't, I was in college in the 90s and I'm a whole different generation, but in the 90s, it had already shifted from being a more collective and communal cooperative experience education, and has become an individual, very individualistic experience. And I just wonder what you guys see as within, I guess, 20 years of you, or 30 years, it had shifted already. What are the elements, Dr. Garrett?
Whether or not the dynamic of education or the whole
No,
is
something like that.
and for the period that you're talking about, from the 60s to the 90s, there was a profound transformation. The movement was eating up inside its own internal contradictions, trying to figure out which way to go next. So it's Velcro, which is modeled partly on the counterintelligence program that was run by the FBI, which is modeled partly on the Red Squad from the San Francisco Police Department that was run by the Chief of Police Cater. It's been a great deal of time and energy and money trying to destroy the very activities that you're talking about. The unity that Thomas was talking about, how people integrated their culture, their own culture that they brought to the table with each other, because that coming together was where the same thing happening with coalitions. People integrated their ideological perspectives in order to reach a certain goal. All of those things came under attack, because I think that one thing that we didn't do is we didn't study hard enough about the fact that the other side was studying. And they themselves weren't trained. They were themselves trying to figure out how could they make the issues, how could they break this up. And so by the time that you're speaking, that's 92 is around the time of the first Gulf War. That's the time of the series breaches. Let me just give you one example. The movement around Black Studies reached the point where Black Studies was on 1,200 campuses. Problem is that we have reached that goal, but most of the people who were involved in the administration and the teaching were careerists.
So it's a law.
Yeah, they already, as it's
Yeah.
pointed out, so the contradiction, the problem was that that group came on to preserve itself, and it drove the cutting-edge people off campus. Or the cutting-edge people had already gone into the communities and didn't want to come back to the campus. Because it was too hard to do that again. So you had that kind of dynamic that was going on. All I'm saying is that the other side studies. That's why I keep saying about DeSantis. Trump may be a gangster, not gangster, not that level, a thug and a hoodlum and this, that, and the other. But DeSantis isn't done. Abbott isn't done. These guys are not done. And what they've done is they've studied our contradictions, our problems, this period of enlightenment. They've studied it, and they decided to destroy it. So that's what I would say. I'd say about the sad state about the time you got there in the 90s. Much of the good stuff has been gutted. And it takes a generation to begin to rebuild again.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's where we are now, I think. And that's the fits and starts with various groupings of people. If they have to go through identity politics, that period, in order to reach a certain level of consciousness, where they feel comfortable with that, in order to go to the next level, whatever it is that people have to go through, I'm the one I can tell them they can go through their process when I go through mine. So, well, at the other end of that is that we have matured, a much more matured and comprehensive, autocratic, and some kind of devolved fascistic dynamic that is moving faster than whatever processes we're going through. And whether that happens on the campus, whether that happens in the community, wherever that happens, that dynamic is taking place. And I don't know what to do next. I do know that what we need to do is to find ways together, find ways to work together to figure out what to do next. That, I think, is what we need to do. And that's why when someone asks me about whether there should be an experimental college, fine. Do whatever it is that it takes to do whatever you can to do the best you can. If the sister is involved in cultural work that's within her own culture or within multicultural, if that work needs to be done, do that. Because we went through 30 years to get to the experimental college. You know, we went through 30 years to get to Black Power. We went through 30 years to get to the women's movement. We went through 30 years. It takes time. And that's what, at some point, some of us need to, are going to have to focus on what are the 10 or 12 or 15 things that we need to do, and then they need to set out to do it. And they will draw, I'll just speak personally, I went on campus intentionally to build what got built. That was the decision. I didn't go to campus to get killed. I didn't go to campus, I was sentenced to prison. I didn't go on the campus. I went on the campus to see if that model could be built. And that's what I was trying to suggest to young people, that if you're doing media, whatever you're doing, You make an intentional decision to advance humanity in terms of climate, do that. It's okay. Do that. Find somebody else if you can, who can unite with you to do that work even a little bit more differently and better than you can. And then work with them or behind them to push them. That's how this thing happens. That's how it's happened for the last 1,000 years. And I don't think it's gonna be any different.
Dr. Garrett, I am deeply grieved by what's happened here. We've lost almost all the students. And I think it suggests a fundamental flaw in the way this program was designed. Each of you have so much history, so much truth, that 2 hours could have been devoted to each of you. And that would be scratching the surface. A one-off program isn't doing it. This is the second time I've been on this campus in 4 years that I've been infuriated because it appears that this rich history is shoehorned in. I've been studying the history of this campus since the early 1970s. I heard things here today that I've never heard before. And I can guarantee you, because I read everything, most of what was said is in no newspaper article, no journal article, no book, no monograph, no dissertation, no theses, and on no website. And I do not understand why this goddamn university continues to occasionally provide opportunities, but opportunities that never fit the purpose. This history should be institutionalized. This shouldn't be a one-off, this should be a course. And I sometimes wonder if the powers that be are waiting for y'all to die. Then they won't have to bother with even shoehorning you in every now and then. I brought one of my students with me today, Bella June, because I wanted her to be able to hear from the people who made the history. Because I told her that Dr. Garrett has no time for intellectuals or scholars that are talking about theory. All he wants to know is praxis. And I resent it that this university and my university, University of California, Berkeley, continue to treat history as if it's nostalgia, as if it's somehow absent from or separate from the struggles that we're engaging in now. I'm more frightened for my student now than I was when Nixon got in 68. And what you did then with the Black Students Union, Third World Liberation Front, Experimental College, has practical application to address what we're dealing with now. I wrote something. Before I met you years ago, this is what my analysis was of the Black Student Union, before you ever said a word to me, and this is based upon reading primary sources. San Francisco State's Black Student Union was a tightly organized, highly disciplined revolutionary cell or cadre, less like the CIA-subsidized National Student Association, and more like the anti-colonial movements that were then liberating Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, Latin America, and the so-called Middle East from the colonial domination of England and Europe. Like these third world cells or cadres, it had an above-ground wing, which is headed by a campus coordinator, your comrade Jerry Renato and Mariam El-Wadi, and an underground wing, led by an off-campus coordinator, you. While the campus wing agitated for campus reforms, the underground wing organized for wholesale insurrection against what is now called racial capitalism. That is, the BSU was dedicated to revolution, not reform, to fundamental change, not cosmetic alterations. Or to put it another way, instead of fighting to put lipstick on the pig of racial capitalism, it fought to shove a steak up the pig's behind, mounted on a spit, slowly roasted and consumed whatever might be useful in furtherance of building a new, freer, and more just world. That's not nostalgia.
That's all right,
And this isn't available to any of you. On this campus, this campus's library website is the second worst website of any California university after mine at Berkeley. The search engine is so poor, it's as if it's designed to defeat understanding rather than aid it. If you want to search the gator, forget the search engine because it's going to give you false results. You have to go old school, read issue after issue, page after page. But why do you have to work so hard? If ethnic studies are serious, don't do a one-off program. Create spaces for people like yourself or students who are studying this. Make it permanent and make it do what you did then that is relevant to the community, not just to this campus. When you brought Nathan Hare here, who is considered the father of modern Black studies, he had a motto. And when I got into Black studies, we were all taught that. Bring the campus to the community and the community to the campus. God damn it, it still hasn't been done.
Thank you, sir. try to top that. No way. No way, I'll leave that alone. So, all right, so we okay?
I'm sorry we didn't have more time for this event. Do you
Well,
watch
you-
videos? Do you want to see
control
some
time.
slides? Do you want to see some slides? All right.
You don't, I think you need to, we understand that you don't control.
Oh, I know. Yeah, no, I'm not saying
Yeah,
that.
so-
I'm saying next time we're going to bring more time. That's I hope.
The university is now corporate entities.
Of course, yeah.
And therefore, that's what they do. The president's main goal is to raise money. You know, each chair has a raise, but it's what it is. So the question is, how do you change, nudge against that and change that? And so that's, we could use that, and we could use this as a means to say, well, look, we need to get some resources so that the experimental college can bring in people like Thomas Theda and others and pay them to
Lead a seminar. Lead a seminar, maybe.
yeah, we do that. So that even that would be an opening. Those are the kinds of things that at the nickel and dime level can are possible. I mean, my thing is it's taken us at least 3 years to get to this setting. 3 years. Because it took Nathan Hare 50 years to have his name spoken. So that's where we are. So we have a lot of work to do. So you go to this list of, if you we'll just scroll through this list of folks.
Tell us a story, yeah.
That's Jerry Venato on the right. It's not Venato. I call him Venato. But Jerry Venato presented that 2 years ago. That's the two of us grinning. But Jerry is the guy who was here before the Negro Students Association and right through the strike. And he was like a leader. That's E.C. Williams, Judy Juanita, who's now teaching at Berkeley, but she's also a great writer. There's Ron Bridgeforth, who was in hiding for 40 years because of his work. And Joanne, that's Joanne Mitchell Stringer, that's the lady who came and tapped me on the shoulder and say, you know, you just need to stop talking to these white radical students and come over here and talk to us. And he said, well, she and Vanetta McGee, you folks have never heard of Vanetta McGee? This is incredible, you heard something who Vanetta McGee is.
Thomasina Bushrod.
Thomasina Bushrod. She's one of the great of the 70s, along with the guy mentioned Oscar Williams. Now that's Sonia Sanchez, who's now won all the poetry awards. She's an icon in poetry. She had not published. Before she came to San Francisco State. Cynthia Washington was the band sister in Southwest Georgia in SNCC. She was terrible. She and the sister House. What's the sister name? Gloria. Yeah, Gloria House. There were two women who were just outrageous. Walk right up to the sheriff, slap the sheriff upside the head. But we brought her out, and because what was happening is the Black women were struggling with the hair questions Black women do. All women do, I guess, I don't know, that's y'all's program. But she came because she had a natural, and the sisters wanted to know if they would still be attracted to men if they were natural. And she said, hell, the first person you have to be attracted to is to yourself. And if you can cut that corner, the rest of the corners are already cut. Oh, she's terrible. Anyway, that's Cynthia Washington. I loved it. That's George. Y'all know George Murray, who became this is him, as I really do believe, is I think he's teaching English course here. 50% of the students in our classes, I keep saying people, were non-Black, because we didn't have to bar, we weren't afraid of white people. We had students, our thing was to build students' confidence, information and confidence was a mantra. So you could have these things. This guy turned out to be a great teacher right out of the Church of God in Christ, fundamentalist Black church. And he was the guy who was the first militant preacher, great actor, but also became the Minister of Education for the Black Panther Party.
Excuse me, Dr. Gary, who was the first Minister of Education?
I'm not, that was somebody who was underground. It was one of the
Excuse me, Dr. Gary, do you notice that he's teaching on Black nationalism, the names behind him in the first program?
Marcus Garvey.
Malcolm X, Dr. Carmichael, do you notice the book he's holding?
Huh?
Do you notice the book he's holding?
No, I don't.
The autobiography of Malcolm X.
Who?
The autobiography of Malcolm X.
So all I'm saying is that, but your class for that, he's already, he's a detailed, anyway, let's go on. He's gonna, you want detail. Belva Davis, very quickly, Belva Davis on the left, she became an icon, television news commentator.
The Associated Students
30, 40 years. Go ahead.
legislature here at San Francisco State College was a highly tensed one. The meeting room was filled to capacity for a vote as to whether the Associated Students should continue financial support of the All Negro Black Students Union project of Black communications. The project is headed by poet Leroy Jones.
That's me.
That's Murray. And in the background is Jerry.
That's Billy Stewart.
It's my contention that a university has no real moral basis for existence unless it is there to refine experience in the communities at large, whether they be white communities or Black communities. The university is supposed to refine that experience. It's supposed to analyze that experience and show it to the light of reason so that each man may benefit by it. Now, we all know, for instance, that Black people, the majority of them, cannot go to college. If they could, we wouldn't have to go through this kind of inquisition because the program would be passed easily.
You see, read from the script. But Belva Davis, the Black student unions, whenever somebody, the news people come on campus, all white men who were all the reporters, the TV, the guys with the cameras, all white men. And we passed an edict that the next time they come on all white men come on the campus, the crew, we're gonna run them off. And we said, they said, well, we'll send over, we got this stringer who's a Black male. We sent him over a Black woman. And they had to hire Belva Davis. She became the first Black woman newscaster of any station. And that opened it up for, God, I can't think of the Japanese sister's name, who's on the air for 100 years. That opened the door for women to become something other than weather girls, because that's what they were called at that time. So we broke that, we weren't trying to break it. We were just sick of looking at white men all the time. And that changed the face of it. I don't know how to explain it to you. Once you make that decision that you're gonna open, that here's what you want. You decide that you're prepared to risk your life for it. Just to have a Black woman come forward and be the person who interviewed you. So she comes on the campus, and the first group of people she interviews are all women. Changed the whole scene about what the shots would be in the evening groups, because they are women. Why? Because it's just normal process. I'm sorry. I just love this lady.
Someone else was controlling the media for once.
Huh?
Someone else was controlling the media for
Somebody
once.
else had to, because they had to, the San Francisco State was big, besides the Haight-Ashbury, it was San Francisco State. So like it's like Trump today. People would spend the whole day, what is going on in San Francisco State? And then after like, okay, so you have Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael here, that's him again. Here, this is Jamil Alameen, his name was Rap Brown. He replaced Stokely. This is Ralph Featherstone. His brother's name. Very, very good fundraiser, can't think of his name. This is Ivan O'Donnelson. That's me over in the corner. trying to hide, but I'm always trying to hide. So my thing was I was standing behind these folks because I'm an organizer. I'm not a leader. But those are the sick folks that we brought to the campus who gave speeches at Berkeley and whatever. But they did workshops under the aegis of the experimental college. So when they came out and they would do these snake-type elevator workshops, now we had young people from Haight-Ashbury and Fillmore. We also had young people from the Mission, which was then heavily Latino. The largest contingent were the Japanese students that was the largest Asian community on the campus at that time. And there was always 15 or 20 students, Japanese American students, who would come and sit in on all our stuff. Because they felt comfortable. Anyway, these are the slick folks. That's Mariam Al-Wadi.
Right now, we're gonna have Mariana Wadi have some things to say.
I don't know if you get all of what I have to say, but as a Black mother and a Black woman, I feel education has a dual role. And I'm particularly concerned at the kind of action that has been taking place across the nation in the area of education. The idea of decentralizing schools so that schools can really meet the needs and demands of people in the community, Black people in the community. Function of a school is to prepare you for the kind of life and the quality and style of life that is meaningful to you as a human being. Traditionally, education in the United States has been designed to turn Black people into Negroes, into slaves for the system. We're not tolerating that any longer. As a Black mother, I'm going to see to it, by whatever means necessary, that my son will have an opportunity to be a man, a Black person, and a human being, and have the style and quality of life that he determines is needful and fulfilling to him. That's what we're here for, to see to it that kind of survival, that kind of struggle is realized for these children, because we are building a nation that is going to have what we feel is necessary. We have built a white nation. We are building a Black nation.
Brilliant lady. You just don't know every day dealing with the Marianas. And that's why the guys got beat up in the gator. Because they disparaged her. They said she was an ugly Black bitch in the gator. So then they got a whooping right after.
Right.
So,
Couple more
you
slides.
guys don't know Vanessa McGee, that's extraordinary. She was the comment here.
Yeah.
They don't know Vanessa McGee, that's incredible. There's a lot of things. She was a major. Stanley White. Stanley White. These folks I went to jail with. So that's Vanessa McGee. She was one of the people who came and got me, and she was going to be with Professor Mark Allen Davies. I know your name. Is working on a project. We wanted to know who was going to be the lead in the play that Leroy Jones had written and was produced here on the campus. A main character was a Black woman, and Vanetta was supposed to play that role, but she was also doing auditions in Hollywood, so she couldn't do that role. She looked up the name, Vanetta McGee, and then next time we meet, there's going to be a quiz. The fact that you guys don't know this is one of the most stunningly beautiful women on the planet. Okay. This is one of the dance groups, and we're going to get to several of them. This is the stuff that Paul put up because for some weird reason. This is Laura Stallwood. I have the names of all the sisters who involved in it, but there were three main African dance groups that we gained credit for the dancers through the experimental college. And and got some funding for the people who've been teaching. This is at 4'11". Laura Stallwood, incredible dancers, and they were all training and developing various kinds of dance. But this was one of them. I don't know if you have. You can go up to the next slide. And this is Halifu of Samaria, who was in Janice Miller. She was one of the people who was one of those dance folks. The other lead dance group was with a sister by the name of Elazar Barnes. We couldn't get the picture, but there she was. One of the teachers is John Andy, who was one of the key professors, teachers in the experimental college. And what we did was we raised little known things. When we came in to teach the course, he needed to make his rent. So we did for 3 months we paid his rent so that he could teach the course. One of the great jazz musicians of all time. Mel Stewart on the right. This is, I don't know if you've ever heard of this program. What's the name of this program? All right. Yeah, he said, I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay, that's all. He played Henry Jefferson, George Jefferson's
brother, right? And he shows up, and he's really the cold-blooded, nationalist hardliner in this series. He was my Aikido teacher. He was the sensei for me and my work partner. My work partner was Pamela Yashiro, who's a Japanese woman who was born in concentration camps in this country. And she was probably to the right of Malcolm X when he was really cold-hearted nationalist. This was a Japanese woman, hated white folks like it, but she's mellowed out with time, no problem. Anyway, she was born in the camp, but he taught us Aikido. And so we brought him over to teach Aikido in the experimental college, and they ended up teaching course. He's in several movies, but I think he was recurring in this All in the Family for a couple of years. Very, very good acting. He was there from the first day of the strike to the last day of the strike. So Mel Stewart, okay. This is down memory lane.
That's the last slide.
Okay, so I just want to, I did want to, there are a number of others of these, but I did want to at least introduce you to the humanity, the human condition. These people kept me, they're people that I love. We shared a lot of struggles together, but that's the reason. Okay? All right, so did we make our day?
I think we did.
For those of you who stuck it out, but don't.
I want to acknowledge the people on Zoom.
Hello.
Thanks everyone on Zoom for being here. Who is that there? Mr. Yes.
Who is that?
Oh, you want to make an announcement?
Excuse me, guys.
Got a quick announcement, yeah.
Just quick announcement, my name is Becca. I am a volunteer over at the West Oakland Mural Project. It's the Black Panther Museum. Over there, it's really focused on the women of the Black Panther and the work that is done there. We always do a really cool Juneteenth event, Free the People event. Everybody's welcome. Everything's free. Music, dancing, Black cowboys, really cool. Please come. I do. I gave a bunch to Paul. I can give enough people. Please come. It's a really beautiful event. We're talking about like community work and doing this really good grassroots stuff you're talking about. Jill Christina Best, who is who is the proprietress over there. She is doing beautiful work and the community is really beautiful and we want everybody to come.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that.
Oh, yeah.
Before everyone leaves, one last round of applause for Tomasika Nedal. And for Jim Willems, if Jim Willems is still on the call. Thank you, Jim. Mr. Willems. And thank you so much for Dr. Garrett for coming. Thank you. All right. We're going to end the Zoom call. Thank you all. I'm sorry we didn't have more time to ask questions, but we'll have another event soon. Thank you all for coming. Cheers.
Thanks, Dan. See you later.
Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.
You too.